It's Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, where we instantly improve the lives of families of critically ill patients in intensive care, so that you can have real power, real control, and so that you can influence decision making fast, even if you're not a doctor or a nurse in intensive care. In last week's blog, I've shown you 3 phrases you must always use if your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. You can read, watch or listen to the update if you click on the link below this video. In this week's blog, I want to give you insight in how the intensive care team might view a long-term stay of your critically ill loved one in intensive care. And it's time that we ask, is it sexy for the intensive care team to treat your loved one who requires a long-term stay in intensive care? If your critically ill loved one has been admitted to intensive care for critical illness, and furthermore, if your critically ill loved one requires a long-term stay in intensive care, chances are that you feel fearful, frightened, uneasy, challenged, and very vulnerable. First of all, let's just quickly look at the definition of a long-term stay in intensive care. A long-term stay in intensive care is, generally speaking, any stay that goes beyond the 2 to 3 week mark and can last forever, so to speak. The longest stay in intensive care that I have come across in more than 15 years intensive care nursing in 3 different countries is around 18 months. However, I have heard of cases that stayed in intensive care up to 2 years. Intensive care is not a very pleasant environment at the best of times, let alone a long-term stay in intensive care. And with a long-term stay in intensive care, generally speaking, come unique challenges, whether it be for you, for your family, for the intensive care team, and most of all, for your critically ill loved one. Your critically ill loved one who has been, or who will be in intensive care for long periods of time will most likely get depressed due to the fact that the long-term stay in intensive care offers very little or no quality of life. Moreover, a long-term stay in intensive care also offers limited or no privacy and dignity. Furthermore, with the intensive care team holding all the perceived power and also holding the perceived decision-making power and authority, the situation that you, your family and your critically ill loved one find yourself in is a situation where you feel like you have little or no control, power and influence. That is, of course, only if you are like 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care who think and act as if they have no power, control and influence whilst their loved one is critically ill in intensive care. And those 99% of families also don't question the status quo with the intensive care team holding most of the perceived power. That's a big mistake. The 1% of families who do have control, power and influence educate themselves, and they also act like they have control, power and influence, and it makes all the difference. And also, as a quick frame of reference, when I talk about a long-term patient in intensive care, most of the time I refer to a long-term ventilated patient with tracheostomy. There are other examples that require a long-term stay in intensive care, such as ECMO, hematology or leukemia patients. However, the majority of long-term patients in intensive care, generally speaking, require some form of mechanical ventilation with tracheostomy. You and your family may actually get depressed as well, because clearly your quality of life is suffering as well, especially since you and your family spend far too much time in intensive care, and you may find yourself in a situation where you are neglecting your family and personal life. You may also be neglecting your children or elderly parents, and you may be dealing with loss of income since you had to take time off work in order to spend time with your critically ill loved one in intensive care. In fact, you might be close to a nervous breakdown because of all the stress you are experiencing and you are dealing with. Furthermore, what also often happens during a long-term stay in intensive care is that often all parties involved get frustrated, especially if there is little or no progress. And what also happens during a long-term stay in intensive care is that more often than not, your loved one might take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Or your critically ill loved one might take 1 step forward or 2 steps back. In any case, if your critically ill loved one has been in intensive care for any period above 2 to 3 weeks in intensive care, the experience is generally a frustrating one, and the patience and beliefs of all parties involved are tested. And the reality is that if the long-term stay of your critically ill loved one in intensive care is getting too burdensome and difficult, that the intensive care team may not be prepared to invest more time, resources and patience into the recovery of your critically ill loved one. So, therefore, is it perceived as sexy to treat a long-term stay patient in intensive care, or are there any other hidden agendas? Because dealing with a long-term ventilated patient may not actually be perceived as sexy by the intensive care team. What do I mean by that? The reality and the fact of the matter is that at any given time in intensive care there are a lot of moving parts behind the scenes that you and your family have no idea and insights about, and the intensive care team is certainly not shedding any light on any of the mostly hidden behind the scenes stuff, and if anything they try and hide it from you. A classic example would be that if your critically ill loved one has been in intensive care for 2 months and is struggling to come off the ventilator and is depressed, has no quality of life and desperately wants to get out of intensive care but can't because of the ventilator dependency, the intensive care team might come to you and might, quote-unquote, sell to you that your critically ill loved one's prognosis and diagnosis is really poor, and that a withdrawal of treatment or a limitation of treatment would be, quote-unquote, in the best interest for your critically ill loved one. What you also don't know is that your critically ill loved one may not actually fall into a research category that the intensive care team is interested in and is getting funding for. And by the way, research is $1 million industry in intensive care. However, the bed and other resources that your critically ill loved one is currently occupying and using may better be used for a patient or for patients that the intensive care team has a higher priority and interest in treating for obvious reasons. What you also don't know is that the intensive care team has multiple planned admissions scheduled for the days to come, and the intensive care team knows that resources are going to be stretched in the next few days. What you also don't know is that the intensive care team thinks that you and your family have not asked too many difficult questions so far, and that you have been very agreeable and cooperative. Therefore, the intensive care team thinks that they can easily, quote-unquote, sell to you that a withdrawal of treatment and or a limitation of treatment might be in the, quote-unquote, best interest of your critically ill loved one. The intensive care team thinks that you and your family are, quote-unquote, easy prey, so to speak. The intensive care team also secretly thinks that it's actually not sexy to continue treating your critically ill loved one, and they want to focus more on patients that turn over relatively quickly in intensive care. The intensive care team thinks that this is sexy. The intensive care team also has this perception that high acuity patients who require the latest technology, such as ECMO for example, may be more interesting and more sexy to deal with. The intensive care team also doesn't often want to tell you that there are actually genuine options for long-term ventilated patients with tracheostomy in intensive care, such as intensive home care nursing services who specialize and provide intensive home care services for long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomy in intensive care, such as Intensive Care at Home in Australia. Check out intensivecareathome.com.au. You can find a link to intensivecareathome.com.au below this video on the written version of this blog. Other countries such as Germany, Austria and Switzerland have also embraced this far more patient and family friendly alternative to a long-term stay in intensive care a long time ago. Unfortunately, many English-speaking countries are lacking behind in those areas, with the detriment of patients and their families being left without an alternative but to stay in intensive care indefinitely or getting quote-unquote sold on the idea that a withdrawal of treatment or a limitation of treatment would be quote-unquote in the best interest of your critically ill loved one. The reality is that ventilation at home with tracheostomy is a positive reality already, and it can be used in many situations, whether it be for weaning your critically ill loved one off the ventilator, having your loved one at home if they require permanent ventilation, and can be used in end-of-life situations where you, your family and your critically ill loved one want to spend more time at home. Therefore, you and your family need to question the very assumptions of the intensive care team, and you also need to start asking questions, and you need to demand more from the intensive care team. I really hope that this blog helps you to put things into perspective. If your loved one is critically ill in intensive care and requires a long-term stay, and the bottom line is that if you don't have any control, power and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care, that the intensive care team will drive their agenda and they will drive the bus. So the question is, how can you leverage your level of power, control and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care? And how can you be in control of the situation? You will get to that all-important feeling of power, control and influence when you download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn quickly how to get real power and real control, and how you can influence decision making fast whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Your free Instant Impact Report gives you in-depth insight that you must know whilst your loved one is critically ill or is dying in intensive care. Sign up and download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn how to speak the secret intensive care language, so that the doctors and the nurses know straight away that you are an insider and that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. In your free report, you'll also discover how to ask the doctors and the nurses the right questions, how to eliminate fear, frustration, stress, struggle and vulnerability even if your loved one is dying. You get 5 killer tips and strategies helping you to get on the right path to control, power and influence in your situation. You'll get crucial behind the scenes insight so that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. And you learn how you need to manage doctors and nurses in intensive care, and it's not what you think. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog, and I'll see you again in another update next week. Make sure you also check out our Your Questions Answered, where we answer your questions, or send me an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com.au with your questions. This is Patrick Hutzel from intensivecarehotline.com, and I'll see you again next week in another update.